Welcome to this video series from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I am Hanin Ghaddar, the Institute's Friedmann Fellow. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 launched the largest war in Europe since World War II, and it had global reverberations. Today, I am pleased to be joined by my Institute colleagues, Senior Fellow Anna Borshchevskaya and Goldberger Fellow Grant Rumley, to discuss the implications of the Ukraine war of U.S. foreign policy. Grant and Anna are members of the Institute's program on Great Power Competition in the Middle East, supported by the Diane and Guilford Glazer Foundation. Okay, thinking about the big picture a year into the war, what did we get right about Russia and what did we get wrong?
We underestimated the extent to which Vladimir Putin was willing to go in terms of his broader battle with the West. Remember that the invasion of Ukraine is not simply about Ukraine. He's been saying over and over again that the West is using Ukraine to fight against Russia, to dismember Russia, to destroy Russia from within. The invasion of Ukraine, therefore, was never about Ukraine. It was about Putin being at war with the West. And too many Western officials for years have underestimated this point. They thought stating an idea in this way, saying that Putin was at war with the West, went a little bit too far. What did we get right? We were able to come together and provide assistance to Ukraine. On a level that Vladimir Putin probably underestimated. NATO is now on its way to having 2 more members, and the West has managed to stay together despite Putin's hope that the West ultimately will put comfort, economic comfort over principle, and will not stay resilient for as long as it has.
What does Russia's continued war mean for Russia's overall geostrategic position in the Middle East?
When Putin invaded Ukraine, the West immediately took steps to try to isolate Russia. But it has proven more difficult than it would seem. Primarily, the West had done that through sanctions. But what Russia's position, in particular in the Middle East, shows is that Russia is not isolated globally. It has been difficult to isolate Russia globally. Russia is primarily isolated by the liberal free world. In the Middle East, Russia retains an important geostrategic position. We've seen that Russia's position on Syria has not changed. Russia's military posture in Syria has not changed. Russia has come closer to Iran as it ever has been in the history between these 2 countries. For the first time, in fact, Russia is dependent on Iran for its war in Ukraine. So the bigger picture here a year later is that because of Russia's position in the Middle East, because of its relationships with the Middle East, Russia is simply not isolated globally. Russia is, in fact, aligning with the so-called global South.
What are some of the broader implications this war has had on Russia's military presence in the Middle East?
I think today, Russia's military footprint in the Middle East is concentrated in 2 places, largely in 2 different forms. The first is in Syria, as Anna mentioned. It has sort of a traditional military footprint there. It's got a naval presence at the port in Tartus, and a presence at Hmeimim nearby, and then a minor presence in Damascus. And this presence is a hard-fought gain for Moscow. This was a key objective of the intervention. Russia can now stage some of its most advanced bombers and platforms there. And so that's not something that I think Russia is going to give up. No matter how bad Ukraine gets, it could skinny down its presence in some ways and maybe move some personnel out. But an overall withdrawal, I just find very hard to imagine. The other area is in North Africa, but there Russia typically utilizes private military contractors like the Wagner Group, and I think we've seen conflicting reports of some personnel being withdrawn from the area. I think Wagner has gotten more active in the Ukraine battle space itself, especially around Bakhmut. They're sustaining more losses. It's hard to imagine them being able to both actively participate in Ukraine at the scale that they've been participating and sustain their operations in Africa. But so long as Ukraine is bogging them down the way it is, it's hard for me to see them expanding their presence, and sustaining it will be challenging too.
Interesting, because they need the Middle East to still have relevance within the greater south.
That's right. That's right. Well, also, if you think about Russia's position in Ukraine, Russia's from a strategic perspective, Russia needs a position on the Eastern Mediterranean to project power into Southern Europe, into NATO's southern flank. That's why in the run-up to the war, days before the invasion, Sergei Shoigu went specifically to Syria and held naval drills on the Eastern Mediterranean.
Interesting. We see Iran's role playing, and there is a lot of people, Iranian activists, but others calling for the sanctioning of the IRGC now, mainly because of the new Iranian role in Ukraine and the coordination with Russia. Do you see this is happening? You know, Europe's view of Iran has changed, although policy hasn't really changed. Same in the US. There's a lot of shifts in terms of perspective. But on the ground, you still see lack of appetite when it comes to increased sanctions in the IRGC or other Iranian actors in the region. So, how do you see this? How do you see this? Like, do you think Iran's role in Ukraine is going to lead to a lot more drastic reaction by the West, Europeans and the US? And what do you think, what are your recommendations for policymakers when it comes to Ukraine's, Russia's role, but also Iran?
Well, I think if there are stronger reactions, it will take time to build. Because as you said, you've pointed to a disparity between rhetoric that has shifted and reality on the ground that has not. Yeah. And part of the answer is that bureaucracies in general take a long time to change, to adjust. With every sanction package that came out, right, it took time. Russia remains a member of P5+1 group. And in the early days of the war especially, the West continued to see Russia as an important interlocutor in these discussions. Yeah. So we don't have a clear policy on what is it that we're ultimately trying to achieve. It is clear, as you said, that the European view has shifted with regard to Iran, primarily with the Iranian nuclear negotiations. But keep in mind first that the Iranian nuclear negotiations were fairly narrowly focused, again, on the nuclear file. But there are lots of other destabilizing activities that Iran continues to conduct in the region that are unrelated to the nuclear file. From a policy perspective, I think we need to articulate our goals more clearly. We state over and over again that we're going to continue helping Ukraine, and that's important. But I think we need to be a little bit more precise about what we're going to do. We need to articulate clear goals and the time frame in which we're going to do it, because a part of the problem with assistance to Ukraine, for example, is that it often came too late. Lastly, I've always said, and I'll say it again, it's important for Russia to lose on the battlefield. To date, what we've really done, to be perfectly frank, is we've ensured that Ukraine does not lose. But that's not the same thing as ensuring that Ukraine wins. Every war is ultimately settled by diplomacy. But if this diplomacy takes place before Russia is defeated, Russia will not be placed in a position where it has to fundamentally change its strategic calculus. In this situation, in this post-war negotiation. If that happens, Ukraine risks becoming a frozen conflict. We risk a scenario where Russia ultimately is put in a position where it can rebuild its forces and in perhaps 5-10 years' time attack Ukraine again.
Wow.
I think Anna makes a great point. I think we're trending towards a protracted stalemate that goes on for many months. It's hard for me to see one side prevailing over the other in this. I think we're likely to see a series of offensives and counteroffensives. And there is also, of course, the possibility that both sides just simply get tired of fighting, that the overall attrition is so high that the stalemate leads them to some type of negotiations. So that is a possibility. I do tend to subscribe to the belief that the U.S. could be sending them more, and that more assistance could help potentially turn the tide. But I don't know if I'm entirely convinced that it would mean a Ukrainian victory. Okay. But it is possible. I'm not entirely certain that F-16 fighters are going to be the deciding factor in that. Yes. I'm just not entirely convinced of it. So I think we're likely to see a stalemate in terms of what the U.S. can do. And I think so long as we can keep Russia bogged down in this conflict, the better it is for us and our partners. I think it will strain their presence in the Middle East, or it will cause them to make difficult choices as we go into year 2 and year 3 of a stalemate here. I think given their relationship with China, anything we can do to weaken Russia objectively is a net positive in terms of our competition with China. And I think we need to keep up sanctions on key, specifically defense industry officials, but also financial officials. I think we need to, try to work against or try to target some of the countries that are enabling Russia's conflict in Ukraine. Some of those reside in the Middle East, reportedly.
So what should the U.S. do, or the Europeans in general, like when it comes to Iran, not just Russia? What's the way to deal with this new alliance?
Yeah, well, the first thing you can do is try to disrupt the shipments of the drones. There's reports of them going along the Caspian Sea. You can try to target where Iran gets the components from for the drones. There's reports that Iran and Russia want to create a facility to jointly manufacture some of the drones as well. You can try to target your sanctions towards that and try to prevent it or disrupt it in some ways. You also want to prepare your Middle Eastern partners for a landscape where both Iranian drones are sort of battle tested, and some of their tactics, techniques, and procedures are a little more honed, having been fielded in conflict. But also, it looks like there's going to be new Russian platforms in the Middle East as part of a quid pro quo for these drones.
Interesting. So how do you think this is going to develop between Iran and Russia?
Well, first, Russia's position in the Middle East, in particular, its closer relationship with Iran, is providing it another opportunity to continue the war. And so what that means, broadly speaking, is that we're much more likely to see protracted warfare in Ukraine. We see a lot of flashpoints in this war. We see a lot of Russian losses on the battlefield. But from a big picture perspective, these are smaller pieces of a bigger picture. And the bigger picture is that Russia continues to find alternatives to stay afloat, to finance its war effort. And yes, it's costing Russia a lot. But it's also costing the West a lot to continue helping Ukraine. This is another way that Russia continues to align itself with the global South. If we look at the latest numbers, where did Russia export oil in the last year? India was among top destinations for Russian oil. Think about the very early days of the invasion when it comes to China. Putin made a de facto unspoken promise to Xi Jinping that the invasion would happen after the Winter Olympics. So there was clear coordination between Russia and China on the invasion.
Another question I have for you is about, when you look at this conflict that has been going on, what is the main takeaway, at least?
Yeah, there's plenty of takeaways you can take from a year of conflict in Ukraine. I think some of the constants are still relevant. Morale is still a big factor in fighting. The Ukrainians have a worthy cause and high morale and visionary leadership. The advantage typically goes to the defender in a land conflict, and Ukraine's ability to repulse and repel the world's second most powerful military is sort of proving that case. And then, I think there's a quality to quantity as well. Before this conflict, I think a lot of us thought, the next war would feature a lot of cyber and AI and advanced capabilities. But Ukraine is almost a back to the future or back to the past type conflict. It's mass movements, mechanized infantry, artillery, and so Russia has great stocks in artillery and until recently in manpower. And so this has started to look like an older conflict. And so that sort of leads me to some of my broader takeaways, which is, we're seeing in Ukraine the limits of a peacetime defense industry and defense industrial base. Ukrainians are simply using artillery at a clip that, as of right now, the West and suppliers to Ukraine can't match. And so we'll probably make up the difference in the months that follow. But I think the U.S., the West, other suppliers are seeing that there's going to be a demand both to replenish these stocks, but also to build up these types of capabilities in advance of the next conflict. In terms of
next conflict.
In terms of whatever the next conflict turns out to be, I think there's a lot of desire to focus on these advanced capabilities, but this conflict is sort of reminding everyone that some of the basics are still relevant.
Interesting. Grant, Anna, thank you very much for joining us today. This was a very interesting and informative session. I hope people are listening to your recommendations. Thank you.